Earth has limited space, and as we have inhabited more and more of it, many species of plants and animals have found that there is no longer a spot for them. Most of us are familiar with critically endangered and extinct species, but there exists a strange classification between the two. What happens when the entire wild population of a plant or animal is wiped out, but it still exists in zoos, aviaries, farms, gardens, or pet stores? This is part 2 of my videos on species that are extinct in the wild. In this video, we're looking at 20 species that are currently extinct in the wild, feared to be extinct in the wild, or that were at one point extinct in the wild but have since made a comeback. In the tropical forests of central Vietnam lives a beautiful species of pheasant. Male edwardsi pheasants are black with blue and green iridescence and have a white crest on their heads. A rarer color form exists with white tail feathers as well. The species has red patches on the face and red feet. As long as edwardsi pheasant has been studied, it has been rare. The birds are extremely elusive and hide in the thick undergrowth of evergreen palm and bamboo forests. But after the Vietnam War, there was a marked decline in their numbers. Overuse of herbicide, logging, and agricultural expansion have all negatively affected the species. And since the year 2000, there have been no confirmed sightings of a living bird in the wild. Interestingly, edwardsi pheasant has a strong presence in aviculture. About 28 wild birds were captured at some point before 1980 and sent to private collections in England, France, and Japan. Today, the captive population is over 1,000 birds, and they can be found in private aviaries and zoos around the world. Meanwhile, in the wild, the birds are feared to have possibly gone extinct. The only hard evidence of the species in the wild in the last 24 years was a photograph of a dead female taken in 2018. An action plan for the protection of edwardsi pheasant was published in 2015, and researchers at the time had a heavy focus on protecting their native habitats and searching to rediscover any small population that may remain out there. The captive population is considered to possibly be too inbred to have long-term success if reintroduced to the wild. In 2009, a beautiful new species of freshwater shrimp was described from the Indonesian island of Sulawesi. Named the Sulawesi Cardinal shrimp, it was only found in Lake Matano, an incredibly nutrient-deficient lake that supports hardly any life. The shrimp were found to live among the rocks along the shores, down to a depth of 10 meters. The species has amazing coloration. They're bright red, with red and white legs and small white and blue spots. Because of their beauty, they were quickly taken into the aquarium trade, where they have become one of the most sought-after species of shrimp. While there are probably tens of thousands in home aquariums around the world, no wild specimen has been seen since 2013. They were locally abundant when they were first discovered, but over the course of only a few years, their habitat was altered enough to cause them to disappear entirely. Hydroelectric dams on Lake Matano have altered the shoreline of the lake. Nickel mining has polluted the water, and the introduction of flowerhorn cichlids to the lake likely means that the shrimp fell prey to the newly introduced predators. In 1961, a Mexican ichthyologist discovered a new species of splitfin. It was only found in a single spring-fed pool in Tocumbo, located about 40 kilometers south of the Lago de Chapala. The adult fish measured between 6 and 7 centimeters, were a silver-gray color with a yellowish shimmer and mottled pattern. Specimens were collected and brought into the aquarium trade, and today they're known in English as the Polka-dot Splitfin. In 2015, a decision was made that would have dire consequences for the species. The only pool that the Polka-dot Splitfin lived in was drained, cleaned, and lined with concrete in order to turn it into a swimming pool. When biologists got word of this a couple years later, they quickly made plans to perform surveys to see if the species may have survived. Sadly, no survey has ever managed to rediscover the fish. The other fish species that were known from the pool all managed to recover, and since the disappearance of the polka-dot splitfin, other species of live-bearing fish have moved in and filled the ecological hole left by their extinction. The species had become limited to a small population kept in captivity. But recent genetic research has offered some hope for the polka-dot splitfin. Another species of fish that was described at the same time by the same ichthyologist is the San Juanico splitfin. It occurs about 20 kilometers away in a small chain of lakes known as Presa de San Juanico. It looks a lot like the polka-dot splitfin, only being less yellow and having slightly smaller spots. Morphologically, they don't appear to be exactly the same, but recent genetic research has called into question their statuses as separate species. For now, the polka-dot splitfin remains extinct in the wild, and the San Juanico splitfin is assessed as critically endangered due to its small range, though the population is considered stable. On the 11th of June 1976, a Dutch aquarist known as Theo Steinfort was traveling through Tanzania when he stopped to collect fish at a swamp on the side of the road. The fish trade for the home aquarium was growing, with new species regularly becoming available, and Steinfort was hoping to find something new and exciting in the swamp. What he found was a 3.5 centimeter long species of killifish, which had males that were mostly a pale blue with orange and red fins. He collected enough of the fish to establish a captive population, and Steinfort's killifish was scientifically described and made commercially available. The species proved to be rather difficult to keep in the home aquarium. Nevertheless, it survives in aquaculture to this day. When biologists and aquarists returned to the site to collect more of the fish, they failed to find them again, and the only time the fish has been known to be seen in the wild was when they were collected in 1976. The swamp was on the right side of the road, 8 kilometers before Kimamba, traveling towards Morogoro. No one knows why Steinfort's killifish disappeared from the swamp, or if it occurs anywhere else, but all subsequent searches for the species have failed to turn up any new specimens. It remains assessed as critically endangered and possibly extinct in the wild. Fossil evidence shows that Bermuda was once home to some 15 species of land snails in the genus Poecilozonites. Of those 15, only 4 survived into modern times. Island diversity is often extremely unique because of its isolation, but this also makes it very fragile. The introduction of non-native species can spell disaster in only a short time, and this was the case for the Bermuda land snails. First came the introduction of mammals, which, while horrible for the snails, didn't manage to wipe them out entirely. Then, beginning in the 1920s, several species of snail were accidentally introduced. These introduced snails outcompeted and even ate the native snail populations. By the 1990s, all 4 of the Bermuda land snail species were assumed to have gone extinct. But a couple of lucky finds were in store. First, in 2002, an intern at the Bermuda Aquarium, Museum and Zoo was sent out to old research sites for one of the last known species, the lesser Bermuda land snail. Amazingly, he found a single clutch of a few dozen eggs at one of the sites. They were collected and sent to the London Zoo, where a captive breeding program was begun. Within only 2 years, the species could no longer be found at this site, and it was again believed to have gone extinct in the wild. Then, in 2014, a small colony of the greater Bermuda land snail was discovered in a very unlikely spot, in a small alleyway in the city of Hamilton. It's believed that the snails colonized the alley before the invasive snails spread across the island, and being confined to the middle of the city, they were protected from predation. They too were collected and sent to a breeding program in the UK. Since the two breeding programs began, at least 4,000 greater Bermuda land snails and 800 lesser Bermuda land snails have been reintroduced to the island. The greater Bermuda land snail is known to successfully be holding on in the wild and is assessed as critically endangered. Meanwhile, the lesser Bermuda land snail is assessed as critically endangered and possibly extinct in the wild, as the reintroductions have yet proven to be successful or sustainable. In the 1930s, a Chinese Boy Scout leader was on White Cloud Mountain near the city of Guangzhou when he discovered an interesting species of fish. It measured about 4 centimeters long and was silver-green overall, with bright red tail and dorsal fins and black, blue, and pink stripes down each side. It didn't take long for the species to become popular in the aquarium trade, where they became known as White Cloud Mountain minnows. By 1960, they couldn't be found in the wild anymore, and they were feared to have gone extinct. As far as anyone knew, they could only be found surviving in the pet trade, where they were easy to keep and breed. But in 1980, something strange happened. The White Cloud Mountain minnow was rediscovered in the wild, but it was nowhere near where anyone expected it to be. About 450 kilometers southwest of Guangzhou is the island of Hainan, and there, a population of the fish was found surviving. It appeared as though the fish represented a native population, but no one knows for sure. Perhaps the fish really had gone extinct in the wild, and the new population was actually an established introduced group from the pet trade. Or maybe the species once had a much wider distribution, and only a few small populations remained. We may never know. But today, outside of the home aquarium, the species is only known to occur on the island of Hainan. In the West African country of Guinea is found one of the world's most biodiverse and endangered ecosystems in the world. The Guinean forest ecosystem has already suffered from a 90% loss due to logging and mining in the region. In the southeastern corner of the country lies a 110-kilometer-long range of hills known as the Simandoa. While the biodiversity of the hills is in and of itself a national treasure, the hills are also full of iron ore. In the early 2000s, the country set out on an ambitious plan to create one of the biggest iron ore mining operations in the world. A huge part of the hills was to be mined, and a 650-kilometer-long railroad was to be constructed to get the product to the coast of the country. As the large-scale mining began, conservation groups became concerned for the region's biodiversity. They sent out teams to assess critical habitats in an effort to plead for the protection of the ecosystem. In 2002, the operation was getting close to a little-explored cave system, so Conservation International sent in a rapid assessment team to see what species were present in the caves. One of the species they found there was a type of cockroach that had never been recorded scientifically before. Named the Simandoa cave roach, the species was mainly glossy black and dark olive green, with reddish legs and yellow stripes across the abdomen. It lived on the guano of bats that inhabited the cave, and wasn't known from any other location. Researchers hoped that this would be enough to stop the destruction of the caves. It wasn't. Shortly after the species was described, the caves were entirely destroyed by the mining operation, and now the species only exists in captivity. In the shrublands and grasslands of Mali, Niger, and Chad lives one of the rarest mammals in the world, the dama gazelle. Once found across much of North Africa, the dama gazelle has been hunted relentlessly and their habitat has been destroyed. So much so that over the last decade alone, it's estimated that the wild population has decreased by as much as 80%. The species has 3 subspecies, each distinguished by the amount of brown and white fur on the body and the morphology of their horns. The 2 lighter subspecies are the Barbary and Adra gazelles. Both have mainly white bodies, with brown on their necks that extends onto their backs. They're both listed as critically endangered and are extremely rare in the wild, with a total population numbering no more than 300 animals. But the rarest of the subspecies is the Mhorr Gazelle. It's the easiest to distinguish, being mostly brown with clear delineations between the brown and white spots in the fur, and having horns that are much more pronounced than the other 2 subspecies. They once ranged primarily in the Sahel region, but have since disappeared from the wild. Realizing that the subspecies was in dire straits, a reserve was established in Spain in 1971 in an effort to safeguard the species from extinction. In 1978, a second reserve was established in Chad, but 9 years later, it was abandoned due to civil unrest in the region. Various attempts at reintroduction have taken place, and they've all ended in the released animals being poached or killed by domestic dogs. Until major policy changes occur in North Africa and spaces are protected for rare and endangered fauna, the Mhorr Gazelle is only able to survive in zoos, private ranches, and wildlife reserves outside of their native range. The island of Guam is an unincorporated territory of the United States located in Micronesia. It was once home to a diverse array of species, including a long list of endemic birds. But like with other island species on this list, the introduction of non-native species has had catastrophic effects on the wildlife of the island. The worst was a species of snake that arrived by accident sometime after World War II. The brown tree snake is a nocturnal arboreal snake that has a diverse appetite. The species has been observed eating birds, eggs, reptiles, insects, small mammals, and even human trash. The birds of Guam had few natural predators and weren't adapted to avoid the snakes. Within only a short time, the brown tree snakes had eaten many of the endemic birds into extinction. When they ran out of birds to eat in the trees, they turned their attention to a bird that mostly lived on the ground, the Guam Rail. These medium-sized brown birds were once common on the island, where they could be found in forests, grasslands, and fields. The Guam Rail is too big for a brown tree snake to eat, as they measure about 25 centimeters in total length. But the snakes began to raid the rail's nests, consuming their eggs. In the 1960s, there were as many as 80,000 Guam rails on the island, but by the mid-1980s, they were practically gone. The last few birds were rounded up in 1987, and the Guam rail went extinct in the wild. A breeding program was established on Guam and in zoos across the United States, and efforts to preserve the species began. Attempts have been made to reintroduce the rails to the island with varying success. One attempt at the Andersen Air Force Base in 2006 ended in disaster when feral cats killed all of the introduced birds within only 8 weeks. More recently, a 22-hectare forested area on Guam was cleared of snakes and a barrier fence was put in place. Some rails were introduced, and based off of sound recordings, it appears that they are successfully breeding in the protected area. But today, the majority of the world's population of Guam rails remain in captivity, though there are established wild populations on nearby Rota Island and the Cocos Islands. In 1934, 2 American botanists were exploring on Pitcairn Island in the South Pacific when they discovered a new species of plant that they named the yellow Fatu. It was a flowering shrub that stood about 1 meter tall. The flowers are yellow, and the plant is only found on unstable slopes. The men took cuttings and seeds of the plant and managed to propagate it in a nursery. Over time, it was placed in botanical gardens across the UK and Ireland. But when botanists went looking for it again in the 1980s, they couldn't find any of the yellow Fatu in the wild. For over 20 years, it was feared to have gone extinct in the wild until a single plant was rediscovered in 2003. Unfortunately, the rediscovered plant didn't last long. In 2005, it died in a landslide, and with that, the species was listed as extinct in the wild. The plant has been protected in botanical gardens where it continues to be propagated. Plans are underway to restore enough of the native forest on Pitcairn Island to make a reintroduction of the species successful. The removal of invasive plants is the most important step towards this goal, and hopefully soon the yellow Fatu will make a return to its island home. While the southern white rhinoceros is the most common and widespread species of rhino in the world, the northern subspecies isn't so lucky. The northern white rhinoceros once ranged across Sudan, Uganda, the Central African Republic, and the Republic of Congo. Their population was relatively stable there until there was a problem in China. Rhino horn has played an important part in Chinese cultural art and medicine for hundreds of years. But with a growing population after World War II and shrinking populations of Asian rhino species, demand for rhino horn was growing and the price was skyrocketing. In the 1970s and 80s, there was a huge uptick in poaching in Africa, with local hunters being drawn in by the promise of a huge paycheck. In Sudan and the Central African Republic, where there were less protections for wildlife, the rhinos disappeared quickly. By 1990, there were only about 15 wild northern white rhinos left, all in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Between 1990 and 2003, conservation efforts managed to more than double the population. But poaching became a problem again, and a more drastic plan to protect the subspecies from extinction was put into action. 5 wild rhinos were captured in the DRC and sent to a reserve in Kenya with the hope that they would have more success in a better protected environment. And it was just in time. By 2008, it's believed that the entire remaining wild population was gone, and the only surviving northern white rhinos were all in captivity. Sadly, conservation efforts failed, and in 2008, the last male northern white rhino died, leaving only 2 females alive in the entire world, Najin and her daughter Fatu. The subspecies is considered functionally extinct, meaning that while there are animals that are still alive in the world, they have no natural hope for recovery. Thankfully, sperm, eggs, and embryos have been preserved, with the hope of eventually being able to find surrogate mothers to birth more northern white rhinos into existence, and perhaps, one day, bring the subspecies back. Przewalski's horse is a rare and endangered species. These horses are stocky and smaller than their domesticated relatives, standing about 12 to 14 hands tall and weighing as much as 250 kilograms. They have a dun-colored coat and a dark, zebra-like erect mane, giving them a very distinct appearance. The species once roamed the grasslands and deserts of Central Asia. However, they began to suffer due to competition with livestock, habitat loss from mining, overhunting, and the harsh winters of the region. Their numbers declined throughout the first part of the 20th century, and by the end of the 1960s, they had gone extinct in the wild. Only 130 remained in captivity around the world. Conservation efforts began in 1977, when the remaining captive animals in zoos and wildlife reserves began to be moved around to decrease the amount of inbreeding the horses were facing. By the 1990s, the captive population exceeded 1,500 animals. In 1998, some of the horses were released into the Chernobyl exclusion zone in Ukraine, and the area has acted as a de facto nature preserve ever since, with about 100 wild horses living there as of 2019. Other successful reintroductions have taken place in several national parks and nature reserves in Mongolia, and these efforts have expanded to other sites in Central Asia and Eastern Europe. Today, there are about 1,900 Przewalski's horses living in captivity and reintroduction sites in Mongolia, China, Kazakhstan, Hungary, Russia, and Ukraine, and Przewalski's horse is no longer listed as extinct in the wild. The marbled platy has a similar story to other live bears from Mexico and the southern United States. It was restricted to a very small range in an area with a growing demand for water. For the marbled platy, that range only included the Rio Salado River system in northeastern Mexico. And within that system, it was only known to survive in a few springs, creeks, and pools that had the necessary pH. As water consumption increased, these peripheral water sources were the first to dry up, and the species could no longer survive. Interestingly, it was found in the aquarium trade despite the fact that it doesn't have striking colors at all. The species is almost entirely brown and black with clear fins. Despite this, their rarity has made them a desirable fish for some aquarists to own. The species is available occasionally in Europe and the United States, and there are several reserve populations kept by universities and stock centers. It's also unique in that it's one of the few species that has conservation efforts being led by hobby aquarists, who desire to see it reintroduced to the wild one day soon. Bayezid Bostami was an Iranian Sufi from the 9th century CE. He visited an area that is today part of Bangladesh, and this is where he died and was buried. The shrine of Bayezid Bostami is a holy place today that attracts many visitors. There, one can visit the tomb, the mosque, and a large pond. In the pond lives a species that only has a stable population in this one spot. The black soft-shelled turtle was once believed to be an inbred version of the Ganges soft-shelled turtle, but is in fact its own species. They're only native to the Brahmaputra River in southwestern China, northeastern India, and Bangladesh, but they became so rare that the species was declared extinct in 2002. What no one knew was that the species was still holding on at the shrine of Bayezid Bostami. Visitors to the pond believed that evil spirits had been transformed into turtles, then forced to live in the pond for eternity as punishment. The public fed the turtles over the years, mostly small biscuits, keeping them alive despite the fact that conditions in the pond are far from ideal. Over the last 2 decades, several other populations of the turtles have been discovered in other temple ponds in Bangladesh and India, and 2 tiny wild populations are thought to be holding on in Assam, though the stability of these populations is unknown. The pond at the shrine of Bayezid Bostami holds the largest and most stable population, with over 400 black soft-shell turtles living there. About 300 hatchlings from the pond have been released into the wild, but whether the released turtles are successfully breeding or not remains unknown, as the majority of the habitat they used to rely on is now too polluted to support the species. The California condor is the largest land bird in North America, with a wingspan of up to 3 meters. They have striking black and white plumage and a bald head that has a variety of colors, including yellow, orange, pink, and purple. Being scavengers, the birds primarily feed on carrion. The species once ranged from southwestern Canada to northwestern Mexico and across the southern United States. However, their population began to decline as the human population grew. Their habitat was being destroyed. The birds were being shot, and they began to collide with power lines. But one of the biggest threats to the California condor is lead poisoning. As people shoot other animals in their range, they often run off and die without being collected. The condors are then attracted to the carcasses. As they consume the flesh of the hunted animal, they are also unwittingly consuming high quantities of lead and even fragments of bullets. Over 60% of the known deaths of juvenile condors have been shown to be caused by lead poisoning. By 1987, only 22 condors remained in the wild, so the last remaining birds were captured and brought into captive breeding programs to keep the species from going extinct. California condors are able to double clutch. This means that if the first clutch fails, they will lay a second set of eggs shortly thereafter. Conservationists took advantage of this, removing the first clutch of eggs laid by each mating pair, effectively doubling the output of chicks. Half of the chicks were raised by the adult birds, while the other half were raised by condor puppets to minimize human interaction. By 1991, reintroductions began. Within their range, it is now illegal to use leaded ammunition, and this has had a hugely positive effect on the reintroduced populations. Their numbers continue to increase, and adolescent birds are regularly reintroduced to the wild in California, Utah, Arizona, and Baja California. As of 2022, about 350 could be found in the wild, and over 200 remained in captive breeding programs across the United States. The brome of the Ardennes is a species of grass that was found only in Belgium. Described in 1821, the grass was limited to the calcareous meadows. Because of its tiny range, all it would take was a single catastrophic event and the species would be wiped out. And that's exactly what happened in the 1930s. World War II destroyed huge parts of the grasslands, and after the war, the grass could no longer be found. The species was feared to have gone extinct for decades, until a lucky discovery in 2005. An English botanist stumbled on seeds of the brome of the Ardennes in the collections of the Belgian National Botanic Garden. Within a few years, hundreds of the seeds had been successfully germinated. Despite the successful resurrection of the lost plant, it remained surviving only in botanic gardens for over a decade. It wasn't until 2022 that the grass was finally reintroduced to the wild on some private farms in Belgium. The long-term success of the newly introduced brome of the Ardennes is yet to be known, and the species remains assessed as extinct in the wild. European bison once ranged across much of Europe and what is today Russia. But by the Middle Ages, their range had become restricted to Central and Eastern Europe. They have always been an important game species for people living within their range, but by the start of the 20th century, there were only a few left surviving in north-central Europe and north of the Caucasus Mountains. By this point, the species had been domesticated, and shortly into the 20th century, the few remaining wild bison were hunted to extinction. The Carpathian and Caucasian subspecies were killed off entirely, and only the European subspecies survived on farms. The last wild European bison was hunted in Poland in 1921, and it didn't take long for people to realize that the species needed to be brought back. Only 8 years later, 2 bison were released into a forest in Poland. By the 1960s, there were over 100, and by 2017, 2,270 European bison could be found living in the wild in Poland. They have successfully been reintroduced to 17 European countries, and the wild population across the continent is estimated to stand at over 4,000, with a further 3,500 still living in captivity. The black-footed ferret is an American species of mustelid that's also known as the prairie dog hunter. They're mostly nocturnal and solitary, and as much as 90% of their diet is made up of prairie dogs. They were historically found on the prairies and plains of central Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Much of European expansion on the continent was driven by the fur trade, and the black-footed ferrets were early targets. But being relatively small, their furs weren't worth much, so hunting was never much of a threat to the species. The real problem was when large-scale farming operations came into their range. While the ferrets weren't a problem for farmers, the prairie dogs were, and they were exterminated en masse. As their prey became less abundant, the black-footed ferrets also declined. In 1967, the species was listed as endangered and afforded certain protections, but within only 12 years, they were declared extinct. None were known in the wild, and none remained in captivity. Thankfully, in 1981, a small population was discovered to still be surviving in Meeteetse, Wyoming. Conservationists moved to protect and monitor the species, and their population grew to about 130 wild animals. But this is when sylvatic plague and the canine distemper virus made their way into the population, both proving to be incredibly lethal in black-footed ferrets. The population crashed to only 18, and this time the decision was made to do something far more drastic in order to save the species. All 18 were captured and brought into a breeding program. 7 of the captured animals managed to reproduce, and today every living black-footed ferret is a direct descendant of those 7 animals. In 1991, the reintroductions began, and the species has since been reintroduced to several sites in Canada, the United States, and Mexico. While not every reintroduction has been a success, there are believed to be as many as 500 black-footed ferrets living in the wild today. In South America, there exists a genus of flowering plants that have historically only ever been known to occur in people's gardens. The Brugmansia genus has 7 species, all of which are found in South America. They're characterized by their long, trumpet-shaped flowers, which has led to them having the common name of angel's trumpets in English. It's believed that because of their beauty and medicinal uses, they were popular garden plants among native South American tribes. But at some point over the course of their history, the animal or animals that once pollinated them went extinct. Thankfully, those who cultivated the plants knew how to propagate them, and they managed to survive into modern historical times. No wild specimen has ever been discovered of any of the 7 species. Because of their beauty, they've been introduced to many other parts of the world, and today naturalized populations can be found in North America, Africa, Australia, and Asia. And that's it for today's video. If you want to hear about 20 more species that are extinct in the wild, hit the thumbnail at the end of this video. I need to say a special thanks to my patrons. Without their ongoing support, I wouldn't be able to produce a video like this every week. If you want to support the channel, consider joining us on Patreon. The link is in the video description below. I also need to say a special thanks to all of you who have subscribed to the channel and who faithfully watch my videos and leave such encouraging comments. I started this channel during the pandemic for fun, and I never thought that it would grow to the point of nearly having 90,000 subscribers. So thank you all for watching, commenting, and liking the videos. I look forward to making many more. I'll see you next time.